The Medal of Honor franchise has been MIA for a few years now, and after admittedly other rough years trying to chase that Call of Duty and Battlefield spark during the 7th generation of consoles, with its attempt at modern combat and fast-paced multiplayer gameplay. And it's fair to say that it failed so hard that it destroyed completely all the good faith in the Medal of Honor series. Which is sad because it did used to be a really well respected and very influential WW2 shooter. So here comes Above and Beyond, a Medal of Honor game 8 years after the last entry and in VR, and developed by Respawn Entertainment, whose dev team actually shares a lot of members with the original team that worked on Allied Assault, if sources are to be believed of course, and that's a big deal being that many people think of Allied Assault as the peak of the series, and this is all very promising, but how is the actual game like? Well, let's start as usual with the story, and this one is somewhat of a literal mixed bag. It goes for this Band of Brothers type of story where it focuses on a group of soldiers and their adventures, but because the story keeps sending you on wildly different mission settings, it feels like there's very little cohesion to the overall story. It feels like it's trying to go for this you're a super soldier doing the impossible and single-handedly turning the war, while keeping up a facade of you just being a group of brothers fighting this war together. Even though all of you survive all the way through, and even when bad things happen and the powers that be tell you to stand down, you just overturn those demands without any consequence. I mean, the guy giving you the mission briefings might as well be on his knees, if you know what I mean. And the characters just aren't enough to keep it all together. None of them get much character development outside of the core team, which is just you and 2 other soldiers, which already have an odd dynamic, one of them being a 16-year-old and the other being an old soldier with a troubled past. And their stories work together in a very parental way, even if it's done very unsubtly. But then there's also, in this team, as the silent protagonists, not contributing to the story wise, except you do everything action wise, and it just becomes very awkward. Then the other recurring characters, for the most part, just don't get enough development. A lot of the times characters will look at you, do some expression like, "That's crazy," during the cutscenes, and I was just like, do I know this guy? The worst offender is this Nazi officer. He betrays the other Nazis in exchange for his life, and you're supposed to hate him at first, but then towards the end of the game they just act like he's been redeemed and he's one of the good guys now, even though there never had been a scene where he does redeem himself. In fact, he had scenes where he was still an ass and would let his teammates die for the sake of his survival. Fair to say, it felt very weird, especially towards the end. Like, why are we being nice to this guy? Cutscenes can also just feel like they drag, because you're just literally standing there watching people talk. It's very static. You're locked in place, it's very boring and also annoying, especially when you have a headset strapped to your face. So fair to say I'm not a huge fan of the story, but how does the actual gameplay fare? Well, this is also a mixed bag because it's a VR game, but it's also very reminiscent of a classic early 2000s FPS, not only with its setting of the World War II, but also its health kit system over the more accepted regen system, which in the VR space it's hard to say is classic inspired, since it seems a lot of other big VR shooters have also taken this approach, like Alex and Saints and Sinners. Regardless, there is a big focus on being reminiscent of those older WW2 shooters, with its level and mission designs having a focus on infiltrating enemy bases and destroying them from within, while also having missions that focus on bigger open field fights, with of course a Normandy level, which to be fair is much more justified here given never really experienced that in VR, even though they kinda ruin it with the mission objectives they have in this particular mission. Without spoilers, most of your time in Normandy on the actual beach will not be spent shooting. Regardless, the missions do take you to quite diverse settings within the World War II genre. Honestly, they go for a no stone unturned kind of thing, having tanks and plane and boats and even a water level, but it all feels somewhat lazy in design. Sure, there's variety in the setting, but the actual gameplay can be very repetitive, as you'll never actually drive anything. You'll always be segregated to the turrets, which does get old fast, and some of these just feel low effort, or more likely they didn't have enough time to properly develop. For example, the tank sections, you control the tank with your head and your point of view is outside of the tank, which is kinda weird, which again makes it look like they didn't have enough time to properly develop interiors and controls for the tank. So what we end up with here is just a looking at the target and shooting kind of scene, and this can go for quite a long time and it gets old really fast. Now the actual core of the gameplay, the walking around and shooting, does feel okay, even if the AI can feel very rudimentary, just kinda locking onto you and not moving much. But the guns, while there is quite a learning curve to them due to there being way too many of them that all reload differently, even guns in the same category. Also, talking guns, snipers just don't feel good. They're very uncomfortable to aim with, and the pistols feel borderline useless. Pea shooters. And that sucks regardless of realism. Shotguns feel really good, though despite the rare situation where they're usable, given there is usually a fair distance between you and the enemy, realistically, the weapons you will use the most are the various machine guns and rifles. Those also feeling good, but also suffering the most from the over variety of the reload styles. Now, it is important to point out that there are some levels that really work well in making you feel like a cool action hero that the game kinda implies you are. For example, there's this really well designed train sequence where you go through the carriages shooting Nazis whilst almost having to use no cover, and it feels really good. Unfortunately, levels like this are more of an exception than a rule. Another problem is crouching down, mostly because every item you carry is attached to your body in some way, and as you crouch, the distance between every item is reduced to some extent, and the game can get confused on what you're trying to do, which is really annoying when you're crouching for reloading or using a health kit, which is bound to happen a lot because you're trying to cover yourself from fire while doing these things. Grenades feel good enough, even if it does feel like you're playing a game of Bop It every time you get ready to throw one. Again, because of that big variety of reload, I don't know if you call reload for a grenade, but yeah, that variety of how you have to use a weapon. The thing that on paper it sounds good, but in practice it ends up being overwhelming. Overall, the gameplay is not bad, it's just not doing anything better than what other VR games are already doing, and in some cases, better than this. And in some ways it feels bloated with weapon types that end up being more of a hindrance than a positive. Now, graphics wise, this is an interesting one. The required system specs mention a 1080 as a minimum requirement, and regardless of this being correct or not, it's hard for me to know since I played using a 5700 XT, which is slightly better than a 1080. I don't really have other graphics cards to use in comparison, so take my opinion as you will. These requirements do not feel warranted though for the quality the game outputs. While interiors can look really good and details, the outside can be outright muddy and just bad. Same goes for the character models, who look downright terrifying at times, and that contrast is really jarring. I feel like I'm saying this a lot in this review, but it's really a mixed bag. But regardless of how bad or good it can look, it still just doesn't feel justified given what other VR games that look much better and run much better on much lower hardware. Finally, I want to talk about the sound, which voice acting wise it's passable, not much to say there. Soundtrack wise, I would say the same as well. Not memorable, but it was fitting during the actual gameplay, and I think it was reminiscent enough of those old Medal of Honor games, so that's a positive. But guns, again, mixed bag. Rifles sound really good, whilst shotguns feel muted. And that's kind of my opinion on the whole game. It's an old, big, mixed bag. For everything it does good, it also does something pretty bad. And because of that, I'm giving this one a 5 out of 10. I still enjoyed my time with it. It is a 7-hour game though. I doubt a lot of people will have the patience to put up with it until the end. And honestly, I don't think those people will miss out on much. As a recommendation, I would say skip this one until it's really cheap on sale, unless you're really desperate for a VR single player shooter. It also has a multiplayer, which I decided not to review for this game given its Steam population already being in the 20s less than 2 months after release. And also, if you're looking for VR multiplayer shooting, then this should definitely not be your first choice. Regardless, I hope this review was informative and it helped you regardless of if you decide to get this game or not. But regardless of that, please consider subscribing, liking, and all of the YouTube things you can do for free. And goodbye.